The girl stopped talking on a Tuesday. Not gradually. Not a slow fade from sentences to fragments to silence. She simply closed her mouth after asking me for water and never opened it again. That was 9 days ago. She still follows me. She still eats when I put food in front of her. But whatever lived behind her eyes before she watched her mother walk into a crowd of them with a kitchen knife and not come back, that thing has retreated somewhere I cannot reach. Her name is Lily. She is 7 years old. She is not my daughter. My name is Noor Hadid. I'm 29. I was an arborist for the Oregon Department of Forestry, the person they sent to assess canopy health in the old-growth sections of the Cascade Range. I knew these mountains the way a surgeon knows the body on the table, by system, by symptom, by the particular way damage reveals itself. I never imagined that knowledge would become the only thing keeping a mute child and myself alive. I found Lily in a rest stop bathroom of Highway 58. 11 days into the outbreak, she was standing in a locked stall, perfectly still, her shoes in a puddle of water from an overflowing toilet. Her mother, a woman named Caroline, was outside in the parking lot. I'd watched her through the tree line for 20 minutes before I understood what I was seeing. Caroline had led a cluster of 4 infected away from the rest stop, moving deliberately, a bread knife in each hand. She hadn't come back because she couldn't come back. What she'd done was the opposite of suicide. It was the most precise act of love I'd ever witnessed. I took Lily. There was no discussion. I opened the stall door and held out my hand, and she took it the way a drowning person takes a rope, with grip but without recognition. We walked east into the Cascades, away from the highway, away from the towns in the valley that had turned into feeding corridors within the first week. The infected don't climb well. I noticed this on day 3, when a group of them pursued me up a steep embankment near a logging road. They scrambled at the base, their hands clawing at loose soil, their legs unable to coordinate the complex motor sequencing that incline demands. 2 of them managed 6 feet before tumbling back. The rest milled at the bottom, their necks craned upward, mouths producing that sound. Not a groan, not a scream, but something between breath and intention, like air forced through a throat that has forgotten language. That observation became my survival doctrine. Elevation, gradient, terrain that punishes the biomechanical decay the infection causes. And in my years of canopy surveys, I'd mapped terrain across 300 square miles of the Central Cascades. I knew where the ridges narrowed, where the rock faces were sheer, where the waterfalls carved vertical corridors that no degraded nervous system could navigate. There was one place in particular. I'd surveyed the canopy above Thornton Creek Falls 2 summers ago. A 70-foot cascade that dropped into a granite basin, flanked by basalt walls too steep for anything without technical climbing gear. But above the falls, the creek flattened into a wide bench of old-growth Douglas fir, level ground with natural windbreak, fresh water, and a southern exposure that would matter when winter arrived. The only access was a climber's route on the eastern face, a Class 4 scramble with 2 sections of near-vertical rock that required hands and feet and a functioning cerebellum. It was 18 miles from the rest stop. 18 miles through mountain forest with a silent child, a 30-pound pack, and the growing certainty that the world below the tree line was being consumed. Lily walked without complaint. That was the thing about her silence. It wasn't passive. She moved with purpose, watched where I placed my feet, mimicked my route through deadfall and scree. When I stopped, she stopped. She'd become my shadow in the most literal sense, connected to me by proximity and nothing else. On the second night, I heard them in the valley below. The sound carried up through the conifers like a current through deep water. We kept climbing. The eastern face of Thornton Creek Falls nearly killed us both. Not because of the infected. We hadn't seen any above 4,000 feet, but because rain had turned the basalt into something between glass and oil. I went first, testing each handhold, driving my fingers into cracks that wept cold water. Lily watched from below, her face tilted up, rain streaming down her cheeks. She didn't look afraid. She looked like she was calculating. I rigged a rope, paracord, not ideal, and lowered it to her. She tied it around her waist with a knot I hadn't taught her, something her mother must have shown her, and climbed with an economy of movement that startled me. Her small hands found holds I'd bypassed. Her feet landed on ledges I hadn't noticed. She reached the top before the rope went taut, pulled herself over the edge, and stood there in the rain, waiting for me to catch up. The bench above the falls was everything I remembered: flat ground, roughly an acre, sheltered by a canopy of old-growth fir so dense the rain filtered through in a fine mist. The creek ran through the center, clear and fast, before tipping over the edge into the 70-foot drop. On 3 sides, the terrain fell away sharply. Not quite cliff, but steep enough that I could see the valley floor 2,000 feet below, a patchwork of dark forest and the lighter scars of logging roads. On the 4th side, to the north, the ridge continued upward into alpine meadow. That was the only approach that concerned me. A gradual slope through thinning trees that something could theoretically climb. I'd deal with that later. For now, we had high ground, water, and the sound of the falls drowning out everything below. I built a shelter that first night from materials already present: windfall branches, bark slabs, fronds of western red cedar that I wove into a crude but waterproof thatch. Lily watched me work, sitting on a moss-covered log with her knees drawn up. At one point, she picked up a branch and stripped it of twigs with a methodical thoroughness that suggested she understood the task, then placed it beside my growing pile without looking at me. That small act, the stripped branch, the silent contribution, broke something in my chest. Not sadness, something adjacent to it. The recognition that this child had reorganized her entire existence around the single principle of being useful enough to keep. She'd learned in 11 days what some people never learn: that in a collapsing world, your value is measured by what you can do for the person standing next to you. I wanted to tell her she didn't need to earn her place, that I'd carry her if she couldn't walk, feed her if she couldn't forage, protect her regardless of what she contributed. But she wasn't talking, and I wasn't sure she'd hear the words, even if I said them. So I took the branch and used it, and when the shelter was done, I made sure she entered first. Dawn revealed the scope of the collapse below. From the edge of the falls, I could see the town of Oak Ridge in the valley, or what had been Oak Ridge. No lights, no movement. A gray haze hung over the streets that might have been fog or might have been smoke from fires that had burned themselves out days ago. On the highway beyond the town, vehicles sat motionless in a line that stretched to the horizon. Among them, visible even at this distance, figures moved in that distinctive shuffling gait. The valley was theirs. The mountains were ours. The waterfall between us was a 70-foot declaration of intent. I turned to Lily. She was crouched by the creek, filling a water bottle I'd given her. Her reflection distorted by the current. She looked up at me and, for half a second, I thought she might speak. Her lips parted, her chest expanded. Then she closed her mouth, capped the bottle, and walked back to the shelter. I started planning the cabin that morning. Not a shelter, not a lean-to. A structure that could hold through winter, protect against wind and snow, and tell a 7-year-old girl that someone believed in permanence enough to build it. Building with green timber and hand tools is an argument between ambition and physics. I had a hatchet, a folding saw, and the obsessive spatial memory of someone who'd spent years measuring the architecture of trees. What I didn't have was time to let wood season, nails to join frames, or the luxury of error. Every beam I cut wrong was energy wasted. Every joint that failed was a day lost, and the weather was turning. The Cascades don't ease into winter. They slam a door. I chose a site 15 feet from the creek, on a natural platform of compacted soil between 2 standing firs. The trees would serve as structural anchors, their trunks incorporated into the cabin walls like living columns. I'd seen this technique in old Forest Service documentation of frontier construction that married the built environment to the biological one. The trees would sway in wind, but not fall. The cabin would flex, but not break. Lily became my assistant without being asked. She carried branches. She sorted stones by size for the foundation ring. She peeled bark in long strips that I used for roofing layers. And she watched my hands with an intensity that went beyond curiosity into something closer to memorization, as if she were recording everything in case she needed to do it alone someday. On the third day of construction, something happened that changed the nature of our isolation. I was notching a crossbeam with a hatchet when I heard a sound from the northern ridge. Not the shuffling of infected, but the clear, human rhythm of someone walking upright with purpose. I put down the hatchet and moved Lily behind the half-built wall. Then I picked up the only real weapon I had, a 3-foot length of iron rebar I'd salvaged from a collapsed trail bridge, and faced north. 2 people emerged from the tree line, a man and a woman, both somewhere in their 30s, both carrying frame packs stuffed to bursting. The man was tall, dark-skinned, with a close-trimmed beard and a woodsman's gait, someone accustomed to uneven ground. The woman was white, angular, her red hair pulled back under a wool cap, and she carried a compound bow with an arrow nocked but pointed at the ground. They stopped when they saw me. The man raised both hands, palms out. "We're not sick," he said. "We've been hiking for 4 days. We saw the falls and figured the high ground was defensible." The woman's eyes moved past me to Lily, who was peering around the wall. Something in the woman's expression softened, then hardened again, as if softness were a vulnerability she couldn't afford. "I'm Nor," I said. "This is Lily." "Marcus," the man said. "This is Shay. Are you together?" "We are now. Met on the trail 3 days ago. She was coming from Eugene. I was coming from a fire station in Springfield where 12 of us held out for a week before the doors failed." 12, I asked. "2 survived," Marcus said. His voice didn't break. It had already broken at some earlier point, and what I was hearing was the repaired version. Functional, weight-bearing, but visibly mended. Shay lowered the bow. "The girl, is she yours?" "No, I found her. She doesn't speak." Shay looked at Lily for a long time. Lily looked back with that unflinching stare that children develop when they've stopped expecting adults to make things better. "Can we camp here?" Marcus asked. "We'll contribute. I was a structural firefighter. I can build. Shay hunts." The decision took me less than 3 seconds, not because I trusted them. Trust was a currency that had been devalued to nothing, but because the math was undeniable. Winter was 6 weeks away. The cabin needed to be larger, stronger, and better insulated than anything I could build alone. 2 more sets of hands wasn't a luxury. It was the margin between surviving December and not. "You can stay," I said. "We build together. We share resources equally. And nobody goes below the falls alone." Marcus nodded. Shay uncocked the arrow. The 4 of us stood in the half-built bones of a cabin above a waterfall, and for the first time, it felt less like hiding and more like choosing. Marcus changed the cabin, not through force or argument, but through the quiet authority of someone who understands how structures fail. He walked the site on his first morning, testing soil density with his heel, sighting the slope angles, pressing his palm against the anchor trees to feel for rot. Then he sat down with a stick and scratched a revised floor plan into the dirt. "Your foundation ring is good," he said, pointing with the stick. "But you've got your long axis running east-west. Wind comes off the ridge from the northwest in winter. You want the narrow end, facing into it, like the prow of a ship. Less surface area, less force." He was right. I'd oriented for sun exposure, thinking about warmth. He was thinking about resistance. We compromised. Rotated the plan 20 degrees, gaining wind deflection without losing the southern-facing wall I wanted for passive solar heating through a window opening I'd cover with salvaged plastic sheeting. Shay disappeared into the forest that first afternoon and returned at dusk with a black-tailed doe slung across her shoulders. She field-dressed it at the creek's edge with a folding knife, and the competence of someone who'd been hunting since childhood. The meat changed everything. We'd been subsisting on foraged huckleberries, roasted pine nuts, and the diminishing supply of canned food from my pack. Routine meant energy meant construction speed. Lily sat near Shay while she worked on the deer, not squeamish, watchful. Shay, who spoke rarely and in short, declarative sentences, glanced at the girl and said, "Hand me that flat rock." Lily did. "Now, hold this flat back." Lily did. A transaction was established. Not emotional, not verbal beyond necessity, but functional. Shay needed an extra hand. Lily needed to be needed. The exchange sustained them both. That night, eating venison cooked over a fire ring Marcus had built with creek stones, I asked the question I'd been holding since they arrived. "What's happening down there? What did you see coming up?" Marcus stared into the fire. The light carved his face into planes of amber and shadow. Springfield held for about 10 days. The National Guard set up a cordon on Main Street, but they were spread across 3 towns and didn't have the numbers. When the cordon broke, it happened fast. 4 hours from first breach to total collapse. The infected don't attack in waves. They accumulate. 1 becomes 10, 10 becomes 100, and by the time you realize the math has tipped, you're surrounded. Eugene was worse, Shay said. She was sharpening an arrow tip against a whetstone, the scraping sound rhythmic and deliberate. University campus had 30,000 students. They tried to lock down the dormitories. Most people don't know how to secure a modern building. Glass doors, fire exits, ground floor windows. It was over in 2 days. Did you see any organized response? Military? Government? Helicopters on day 3, Marcus said. Flying south, not landing, not evacuating, just moving assets to somewhere else. We heard a broadcast on a handheld radio. FEMA directing people to the coast, to Portland, for naval evacuation. But the roads to Portland were gridlocked within hours, and anything gridlocked became a corridor for them. I processed this. Portland was 150 miles north. If the coast was the only organized evacuation point, and the roads were impassable, then the mountains weren't just defensible terrain. They were an island. Everything below the tree line was flooding with infected, and we were perched on the only dry ground. "We're not going to the coast," I said. "No," Marcus agreed. "Then this is it. This bench, this cabin, this waterfall. We make it work, or we don't." Shay stopped sharpening. She looked at me across the fire with an expression I couldn't read. Assessment, maybe. Measuring whether I was someone worth building with or someone who'd crack under the weight of the declaration I'd just made. Lily, sitting against the half-built wall with a blanket around her shoulders, reached out and placed her hand flat against the nearest timber. She pressed it there, feeling the solidity of it. It was the closest thing to an opinion she'd offered in days. The cabin took shape over 11 days of continuous labor. Marcus and I felled and notched logs while Shay hunted and maintained our food supply. The structure grew from the ground in a logic I found deeply satisfying. Each course of logs locking into the one below, the walls rising with a visual rhythm that announced permanence. We chinked the gaps with a mixture of clay from the creek bank and dried moss, packing it tight with flat sticks. The roof was a double layer. Cross-beam rafters supporting a lattice of branches, then cedar bark shingles overlapping in rows, topped with a final layer of soil and living moss that would insulate and shed rain. By the end of the second week, we had 4 walls, a roof, a stone hearth with the chimney channel vented through the back wall, and a door frame fitted with a heavy plank door that swung on wooden pin hinges. It was 12 feet by 16. Tight for 4 people, but warm. The thermal mass of the log walls and the stone hearth turned body heat and fire into a sustained ambient temperature that made the space livable, even as the nights dropped below freezing. Lily slept in the corner nearest the hearth. She'd arranged her sleeping area with the compulsive neatness of someone controlling the only territory they have. blanket folded precisely, water bottle aligned with the wall, her shoes placed side by side with the toes pointing toward the door, ready to run, always ready. On the 15th night, I was sitting outside the cabin watching the stars when Shay came and sat beside me. This was unusual. Shay maintained a physical distance from everyone that felt deliberate, as if intimacy were a structural risk she'd calculated and rejected. "The girl," she said. "How long since she's spoken?" 3 weeks, maybe more. I don't know when it started. I only found her 11 days before you arrived. My younger sister went nonverbal after our parents' divorce. She was 9, didn't speak for 4 months. Selective mutism, the doctor called it. The brain's circuit breaker. It shuts down the output when the input becomes unbearable. Did she recover? Eventually. It wasn't gradual. One day she just started talking again, mid-sentence, as if the silence had been a held breath and she'd finally exhaled. Shay paused. But the world wasn't ending when my sister went quiet. This girl has watched her mother die and been taken by a stranger into the wilderness. The input isn't going to stop. I didn't know what to say to that. The honest response, that I had no plan for Lily beyond keeping her alive, felt inadequate. Survival without recovery was just postponement. She responds to tasks, Shay said. She engages when she has something to do with her hands. I've been giving her work. Preparing hides, sorting kindling, fletching arrows. She's precise, focused. The work anchors her. You think that's enough? I think it's all we have. Shay went back inside, and I stayed under the stars, listening to the falls. The sound had become the baseline of our existence, a constant white noise that masked the smaller sounds of the forest and, I hoped, masked our presence from anything below. The infected responded to sound. The waterfall was a 70-foot curtain of acoustic camouflage. But that night, above the fall's roar, I heard something new. A series of sharp cracks from the northern ridge. Branches breaking under weight. Not wind, not animal. The pattern was wrong. Irregular, clustered, the sound of multiple bodies moving through dense brush without the instinct to avoid obstacles. I stood and stared north into the darkness. The tree line was a wall of black. Nothing visible, but the sounds continued for several minutes, moving laterally along the ridge, east to west, before fading. They were above us, not on the bench. The approach was too steep for their degraded coordination. But on the ridge, moving along the high ground, migrating maybe, or searching, the waterfall protected us from below. I'd never considered what might come from above. I went inside and barred the door, and didn't sleep until the sky began to lighten. Morning brought clarity and new problems in equal measure. I told Marcus and Shay about the sounds on the ridge. Marcus absorbed the information with his characteristic deliberation. He closed his eyes, built the terrain in his mind, and opened them with a plan already forming. The northern approach, he said, that gradual slope through the meadow. It's the vulnerability. If they're on the ridge and they drift downhill, and they will, because gravity favors decay, they'll find that slope. And it leads straight to us. Can we block it? No. But we can make it hostile. Deadfall barriers, sharpened stakes in a chevron pattern, trip lines. Nothing they'll understand, but obstacles they can't navigate with their motor function. Think of it as terrain-based filtration. The gradient already eliminates 90% of them. We need to eliminate the rest. We spent 2 days fortifying the northern approach. Marcus designed it like a firefighter designs an escape route. In reverse, instead of clearing a path, we obstructed one. Fallen trees were dragged into interlocking barriers. Sharpened stakes, Douglas fir saplings stripped and pointed, were driven into the soil at angles. A series of trip lines made from paracord were strung at shin height across the narrowest section of the approach, where the slope funneled between 2 rock outcroppings. Shay took a position on a high boulder that overlooked the entire northern face and spent hours studying the terrain through a pair of compact binoculars she'd carried in her pack. On the second afternoon, she came down and reported what she'd seen. There's a group of them on the ridge, 15 to 20, moving along the tree line in a loose cluster. They're not heading toward us specifically. They're following the ridge east, probably tracking some stimulus I can't identify. But 3 of them have separated from the group and are moving downhill, toward the bench, toward the meadow. They'll hit the slope in a few hours. We positioned ourselves, Shay on the boulder with her bow, Marcus and I behind the first barrier line with a rebar and a sharpened staff he'd fashioned from a young hemlock. Lily was inside the cabin with the door barred. I'd shown her how to lift the bar, and more importantly, I'd shown her how to replace it. The 3 infected arrived at the meadow's edge in the late afternoon. From 50 yards, they looked almost human, upright, moving with what a distant observer might mistake for purpose. But as they closed the distance, the wrongness emerged. The lead figure, a woman in a torn flannel shirt, walked with her left arm swinging loosely from a shoulder that had partially dislocated. The second, a heavy-set man, dragged one foot in a circular motion that carved a groove in the soft meadow soil. The third was smaller, faster, its movements less decayed, recently turned, still retaining much of its living coordination. The first 2 hit the barrier line and couldn't process it. They pressed against the deadfall, hands grasping at branches, bodies tilting forward as if the concept of obstacle didn't register in whatever remained of their cognition. The trip lines caught the heavy-set man at the shins, and he went down, tangling in the cord, his movements becoming more frantic and less effective. The third one, the fresh one, navigated the first barrier, stepped over the trip line, adjusted its path around the second deadfall, and kept coming. Shay's arrow took it in the chest from 20 yards. It staggered, looked down at the shaft protruding from its sternum with an expression that was almost curiosity, and continued forward. The second arrow entered its left eye socket, and it dropped without sound. The other 2 remained tangled in the barriers, their groaning carried away by the waterfall's roar. Marcus and I dealt with them at close range. It was the first time I'd done that. Stood near enough to see the burst capillaries in their eyes, the gray marbling of their skin, near enough to smell the sweetness of active decay. Marcus looked at me afterward. That fresh one adapted to the barriers, I noticed. Then this system has a shelf life. They're learning, or the new ones are better than the old ones. A problem we'd solve tomorrow. Night, we burned the bodies and checked our defenses by firelight. Winter arrived, not with a gradual cooling, but with a single night that dropped the temperature 30 degrees and coated the world in frost so thick the trees looked dipped in porcelain. I woke to Lily shaking my arm. The first time she'd initiated a physical contact since the rest stop, and pointing at the cabin's single window. Outside, the creek had developed a skin of ice at its margins, and our breath formed clouds inside the cabin despite the hearth's embers. The cold was both enemy and ally. The infected, we'd observed, slowed in low temperatures. Their already compromised motor function degraded further as fluids thickened and joints stiffened. On the coldest mornings, I could see them on the valley floor through Shay's binoculars, standing motionless in clusters like grotesque statuary, waiting for the afternoon warmth to restore their movement. Winter was a partial ceasefire. But winter on a mountain bench at 4,000 feet was its own species of threat. Our food supply, despite Shay's hunting, was finite. The deer were migrating to lower elevations as snow accumulated. Huckleberry season was over. Pine nuts required hours of processing for minimal caloric return. We needed to stockpile aggressively, and stockpiling meant venturing further from camp, down the slopes, closer to the territories the infected occupied. Marcus proposed a supply run to a Forest Service cabin he'd spotted on a topographic map Shay had been carrying. It was 3 miles southwest, lower in elevation, accessible by a ridge trail that skirted the worst of the infected concentrations. He estimated a day trip. Down, scavenge, back up before dark. "I'll go alone," he said. "Faster, quieter, less risk." We agreed nobody goes below alone, I said. That was before winter. The rules have to adapt. Shay was sharpening arrowheads by the fire. She didn't look up. He's right, Nor. One person moves quieter than two. And we can't leave the bench undefended. Not with activity on the ridge. The logic was sound. I hated it anyway. There's a particular anxiety that attaches to watching someone walk away from safety toward danger. A combination of guilt and helplessness that settles in the stomach and stays there until they return or don't. Marcus left at dawn with a frame pack, the rebar, and a walkie-talkie, one of a pair Shay had been carrying. Short range, battery-powered, their utility limited to about 2 miles in mountainous terrain. He promised to check in every hour. The first 3 check-ins came on schedule, static-laced but clear. He'd reached the ridge trail. He'd made the descent. He could see the Forest Service cabin. Then the 4th check-in was late. 5 minutes late became 10, became 30. I stood at the edge of the bench with the walkie-talkie pressed to my ear, listening to static that sounded like the mountain breathing. Lily appeared beside me. She tugged my sleeve and pointed southwest, down the slope, in the direction Marcus had gone. I looked at her. She tugged again, harder. I know, I said. I'm worried too. She shook her head. A sharp, decisive motion. Then she pointed at her own eyes, then pointed southwest again. She'd seen something. I dropped to one knee and followed her gaze. Through a gap in the canopy, on the ridge trail below, a figure was moving, not with Marcus's purposeful stride, with the uneven, lurching gait of someone injured, or someone turning. Shay was beside me with the binoculars in seconds. She focused, adjusted, and went still. It's Marcus. He's limping, left leg. He's moving fast, but he's favoring it heavily. Injured? I can't tell from here. Bitten? Shay lowered the binoculars and looked at me. The question hung between us like a blade. In the weeks since the outbreak, we'd established an unspoken hierarchy of fears, and at the top, above starvation, above cold, above the infected themselves, was the possibility that someone in the group would be compromised, and the rest of us would have to decide what that meant. We won't know until he gets here, Shay said. And if he's been bitten? She picked up her bow, nocked an arrow, and walked toward the northern approach without answering. I followed, Lily's hand gripping the back of my jacket. Marcus crested the bench 40 minutes later, drenched in sweat despite the cold, his face ashen, his left pant leg dark with blood from the knee down. He collapsed against the first barrier and raised both hands when he saw Shay's drawn bow. Fell, he gasped. Trail gave way. Slid 20 feet down a scree field. Rock opened my shin to the bone. Show me, I said. He rolled up the pant leg, and I saw the wound. A deep, ragged laceration running 6 inches along the front of his shin, the bone visible as a white line beneath torn muscle. It was bleeding freely, the kind of bleed that means no artery damage, but significant tissue loss. Importantly, it was consistent with a fall. No tooth marks, no crescent-shaped impressions, no bruising pattern that suggested a grip or a bite. Shay lowered the bow, not all the way. She rested it at her side with the string still taut, the arrow still nocked. A compromise between relief and vigilance. Priya taught me wound care, I said, naming the thought before realizing I'd confused timelines. No. Priya was from another world, another set of survivors. I meant the Forest Service first aid training I'd received 2 years ago. The module on backcountry trauma that I'd half slept through and now recalled with desperate clarity. I cleaned the wound with boiled water and packed it with strips of a cotton shirt we sacrificed for bandaging. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. Marcus watched me work with the detached expression of someone managing pain through dissociation. The cabin was cleared out, he said. Someone got there before us. But I found something else. From his pack, he produced a handheld GPS unit. Dead battery. A topographic survey map of the surrounding 10-mile radius, and a laminated card with a series of numbered codes and a frequency chart. It was in a locked box under the cabin floor. Forest Service emergency cache. The GPS is useless without power, but the map has something marked on it. He unfolded the map and pointed to a symbol I recognized. The small square with a diagonal line that the Forest Service used to mark underground storage facilities. Supply cache. 2 miles northeast on the other side of the ridge. If it hasn't been found, it could have tools, medical supplies, preserved food. 2 miles northeast is above the meadow, Shay said. Above the ridge where we've seen them moving. I know. You can't walk. I know that too. The implication settled over us. If the cache existed and was intact, it could sustain us through winter. But reaching it meant crossing the ridge. The same ridge that had become a migration corridor for infected, moving through the high country, and the person most capable of navigating the route was now immobilized with a leg wound that would take weeks to heal. That night, with Marcus elevated on his cot, his leg packed and splinted, I sat outside with the survey map and their frequency card. The codes meant nothing to me. Alphanumeric sequences that might have been radio frequencies, grid coordinates, or access codes for the cache itself. The map, though, was detailed in ways our atlas wasn't. It showed elevation contours at 10-foot intervals, water sources, trail conditions, and, crucially, the locations of 3 additional cache sites within a 5-mile radius. We were sitting on top of a supply network designed for exactly this kind of emergency. Not a zombie apocalypse specifically, but the broader category of cascading infrastructure failure that the Forest Service had been quietly preparing for since the Cold War. Someone, decades ago, had looked at these mountains and thought, if everything collapses, the people up here will need to survive. I felt a sudden, fierce gratitude for that anonymous planner, for the bureaucrat who'd signed the requisition, for the supply chain that had transported canned goods and medical kits and tools to underground caches in remote mountain locations against the possibility of a world that no longer functioned. They'd been right. And now I had to be brave enough to reach what they'd left behind. I looked at the map until the fire burned low, and the cold drove me inside. The decision to go for the cache belonged to me, and I claimed it before anyone could argue. Marcus was immobilized. Shay was our only hunter and the bench's primary defender. That left me, the arborist who knew the terrain, could read the contour lines, and had spent 3 years navigating these ridges in conditions far less dire but topographically identical. Shay argued anyway. Not loudly. Shay didn't do loudly. But with the compressed intensity of someone who understands that the plan she's opposing is also the plan she'd choose herself. You're the one who built this place, she said. If you don't come back, this bench becomes a monument, not a home. If I don't go, winter solves the problem for us. We starve in a well-built cabin. She held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then she went to her pack and produced 2 things: a flare gun with 3 cartridges and a hunting knife in a leather sheath. The flare is for emergency signal only. If you fire it, I'll come. The knife is because you need more than rebar if you encounter a fresh one at close range. I took both. I memorized the route on the survey map. Northeast along the ridge, over a saddle between 2 peaks. Then down into a drainage where the cache was marked. Total distance, 2 miles. Elevation gain to the saddle, 400 feet. Descent to the cache, 200 feet. The terrain would be exposed above the tree line for roughly a quarter mile at the saddle. The most dangerous stretch, where I'd be visible and the ridge migration corridor intersected my path. I left at first light. Lily was awake, standing in the cabin doorway, watching me prepare. I knelt in front of her and adjusted the collar of her jacket, a gesture so parental it surprised me. Her hand came up and pressed against my forearm, not gripping, resting, a contact that communicated something I could feel but not name. I'll be back before dark, I said. Stay with Shay, help with the fire. She held my gaze, nodded once, and went inside. The ridge trail was crusted with frozen snow that crunched under my boots with each step. The sound traveled in the mountain air, and I forced myself to slow down, to place each foot deliberately, to minimize the acoustic signature. The infected responded to sound above all other stimuli. Shay had tested this, firing arrows into trees near observed groups and watching them orient toward the impact point with mechanical precision. I reached the saddle in 2 hours. The exposed stretch was everything I'd feared. A bald granite ridge with waist-high scrub, the wind cutting across it with a ferocity that watered my eyes and stole the breath from my mouth. On either side, the mountain fell away into forested valleys wreathed in low cloud, and on the eastern slope below me, spread across a half-mile section of alpine meadow, I could see them, 40 or more. Standing in the cold, their movements reduced to the faintest swaying, frost on their shoulders and hair. Some had been there long enough for ice to form around their feet, anchoring them to the earth like obscene garden sculptures. They were dormant. The cold had pushed them below the threshold of active pursuit. But dormancy wasn't death. When the sun hit that meadow in another hour, the temperature would climb and they'd reactivate. I had maybe 90 minutes. I crossed the saddle at a controlled run, staying low, my breath burning in my throat. On the far side, the terrain dropped into a drainage thick with mountain hemlock, and I followed the contour lines to a flat section of ground where a moss-covered hump of earth indicated a buried structure. The cache entrance was a steel hatch set flush with the ground, its surface camouflaged with soil and vegetation. The laminated card from Marcus's find had a 6-digit code printed beside the cache's map symbol. The hatch had a combination padlock, old and corroded, but functional. I entered the code. The lock resisted, then yielded. I lifted the hatch, and cold, stale air rose to meet me. Below, in the beam of my flashlight, I could see shelving, stacked containers, the dull gleam of metal tools. I climbed down. 90 minutes. The clock was already running. The cache was a concrete cylinder, 8 feet in diameter, 12 feet deep, accessed by a steel ladder bolted to the wall. The shelving was organized with the institutional obsessiveness of government supply management. Everything labeled, categorized, and dated. Freeze-dried meal kits, 200 units, packed in 2003 and rated for a 25-year shelf life. Medical supplies in vacuum-sealed bags. Bandages, antiseptic, suture kits, antibiotics in blister packs. Hand tools, a bow saw, a draw knife, a set of wood chisels, a hand drill, a folding solar panel with a USB output, a crank-powered emergency radio, 2 wool blankets still in their plastic wrapping. I loaded the pack with ruthless efficiency, prioritizing by weight-to-value ratio. Medical supplies first. Marcus's leg needed proper treatment, and the antibiotics alone were worth the journey. Food second. As many meal kits as the pack could hold. Tools third, selected for construction utility. The solar panel and radio went in last, strapped to the outside of the frame. The whole process took 20 minutes. I climbed the ladder, secured the hatch, and resisted the impulse to lock it behind me. We'd be back for the rest. The return was where things broke apart. I'd used 50 of my 90 minutes. The saddle crossing required another 20. That left a narrow margin, and margins in the mountains are the difference between life and an inventory of regrets. I climbed the drainage at a pace that pushed my heart rate into a zone I could feel in my temples, the loaded pack shifting with each stride, the bow saw's handle digging into my kidney through the fabric. I reached the saddle and stopped. The meadow below was different. The infected were moving. Not all of them. Perhaps a dozen had thawed enough to regain locomotion, their movements slow and stiff, but directional. And they were moving uphill, toward the saddle, toward the scent or sound or vibration that my passage had left in the frozen air. I calculated distance and speed. They were 400 yards below me, climbing at a gradient that would reduce their already compromised pace. I had maybe 15 minutes before the first one reached the saddle. Enough time, barely. I ran. The frozen scrub tore at my pants. The pack bounced against my spine. The wind carried the sound of my footsteps in every direction, broadcasting my position to anything with the capacity to detect it. I cleared the saddle, hit the tree line on the western side, and didn't slow down until the terrain dropped steeply enough that I was descending faster than anything behind me could follow. But something was wrong. Ahead of me, on the trail I'd used that morning, a figure stood in the path, not infected. The posture was wrong. Too upright. Too still with the particular stillness of a person choosing to be still. A woman, dressed in layers of mismatched outdoor clothing, a hunting rifle slung across her back, her hands raised in the universal gesture of non-threat. I stopped. We regarded each other across 20 feet of frozen trail. "You came from the cache," she said. Not a question. "Who are you?" "My name is Vera. I've been watching this ridge for 6 days. I saw you go in this morning." She lowered her hands slowly. "There are 3 of us, camped below the eastern face on a ledge. We've been trying to reach that cache for a week, but the group in the meadow has blocked the road. You watched me cross and didn't help. I watched you cross and learned the route. There's a difference." She paused. "You have medical supplies in that pack." "I do. One of my people is sick, not infected. Pneumonia. She's been declining for 4 days. Without antibiotics, she'll die." I felt the weight of the pack on my shoulders, literally and otherwise. The antibiotics inside it were enough for Marcus's wound, and perhaps one additional course. If I gave them to Vera's companion, Marcus's risk of infection increased. If I didn't, a stranger died of a treatable disease while I hoarded the cure. Behind me, the sounds of the infected on the saddle grew closer. "Come with me," I said. "We have a cabin, we have defenses. But we move now, or neither of us makes a decision about anything ever again." Vera unslung her rifle and followed without a word. We ran the ridge trail together, Vera matching my pace with the long, loping stride of someone who'd been living in mountain terrain for weeks. Behind us, the infected crested the saddle. I could hear them. The snap of frozen scrub under dead feet. The low atmospheric moan that seemed to emerge not from individual throats, but from the collective mass of their presence. Vera ran in silence, her rifle bouncing against her back, her breath controlled. She moved like Shay, with the economy of a person who'd learned that excess motion is excess energy. And excess energy is a debt the mountains always collect. We descended below the tree line, and the sounds behind us faded, absorbed by the forest's acoustic density. I didn't slow down until we reached the barrier line at the northern approach, where Shay was waiting with her bow drawn, and an expression that combined relief and fury in equal measure. "Who is this?" "Vera. She has people. One of them is sick." I shrugged off the pack and handed it to Shay. "Antibiotics inside. I need to split the course. You need to explain what happened up there first." I triggered movement on the ridge. The dormant group in the meadow is active, and at least some of them crossed the saddle to our side. The northern approach just became more critical. Shay's jaw tightened. She looked at Vera, assessed her the way a predator assesses another predator. Not with hostility, but with the recognition that the ecosystem had just become more complex. "How many in your group?" Shay asked. "3 including me. A man named Amir and a woman named Joe. Joe has the pneumonia. Amir is keeping her alive on a ledge with a tarp and willpower." "Bring them here," Shay said. And then to me, "We'll need to expand the cabin." That evening, I split the antibiotics. Half for Marcus, half for Joe, whom I hadn't yet met, but whose breathing I could already hear in my imagination. The wet, rattling respiration of lungs filling with fluid. Vera descended the eastern face to retrieve her group with the promise of returning by morning. Marcus, propped on his cot, examined the medical supplies I'd brought back. He was systematic, inventorying, counting, calculating duration. When he reached the split antibiotic course, he looked at me. "Half a course might not be enough for either of us." "I know." You gave away half our medicine to a stranger. I gave it to a person who'll die without it. Everyone dies without something, Noor. That's the new economy. You can't subsidize every deficit. It was the first time Marcus had pushed back with any sharpness, and I realized his injury had done more than damage his leg. It had stripped away the collaborative generosity that had defined his presence from the first day. Pain does that. Narrows the aperture of concern until all you can see is your own body, your own risk, your own diminishing resources. If the situation were reversed, I said, and you were dying of pneumonia on a ledge, and a stranger had medicine, would you want them to calculate the economics? He stared at me. Then he looked away, toward the wall, and said nothing more. Lily had watched this exchange from her corner. She rose, walked to Marcus's cot, and placed her hand on his splinted leg gently, with the precision of someone who understood where pain lived and how to approach it without adding to it. Marcus looked down at her hand, then up at her face. "I'm sorry," he said to her. Not to me. To the child whose silence made her the purest moral compass in the room. Outside, the temperature dropped further. The waterfall's roar had diminished. The creek was beginning to freeze at the lip, reducing the flow. By midwinter, the cascade might stop entirely, and our acoustic shield would go with it. I added wood to the hearth, checked the door bar, and lay down on my cot with a survey map spread on my chest. 3 more cache sites within reach, a growing community of survivors, and a ridgeline filling with the reanimated dead. The math was converging. I wasn't sure which side of the equation we'd end up on. Vera returned at dawn with Amir and Joe. Amir was compact and strong, a former electrician from Medford with calloused hands and the quiet attentiveness of someone who listens before he speaks. He carried Joe on his back. A woman in her 40s, slight, her face flushed with fever, her breathing audible from 10 feet away. He'd carried her up the eastern face of the falls. I tried to calculate the physical cost of that ascent with a 110-pound human strapped to your back and couldn't. The number exceeded what I thought a body could give. We installed Joe on a cot near the hearth, and I administered the first dose of antibiotics. Amoxicillin, not ideal for pneumonia but available, which in the current pharmacological landscape made it the best drug on earth. Joe swallowed the capsule with water, coughed a wet, rumbling cough, and looked at me with eyes that were glassy with fever but sharp with understanding. "Thank you," she whispered. "How much did this cost you?" And I'm deserving an honest answer. "Half our course. My friend Marcus has a leg wound." She closed her eyes. "Then I owe him." The cabin was now home to 7 people in a space designed for 4. Marcus occupied one cot with his splinted leg. Joe occupied another. Amir, Vera, Shay, Lily, and I distributed ourselves across the remaining floor space, overlapping sleeping areas, negotiating the intimate logistics of breathing room and personal boundaries that become critical when walls compress social distance to 0. Vera integrated herself into our routines with a pragmatic efficiency that reminded me of Douglas, though I'd never met anyone named Douglas. And I caught myself constructing parallels to people who existed only in the imagined narratives of other survivors, other stories. The mind does this in crisis. It seeks templates, patterns, the reassurance that someone else has solved this equation before. What Vera actually brought was intelligence. She'd been a park ranger in the Umpqua National Forest before the outbreak, and her knowledge of the Cascade ecosystem was as deep as mine, but differently oriented. Where I knew trees, she knew terrain. Where I knew canopy, she knew hydrology. Together, we sat at the table Marcus had built from the remnants of a fallen cedar and mapped a survival plan for winter. The cache system was the key. 3 additional sites, each within a day's round trip, each potentially stocked with supplies that would extend our viability. But each trip required crossing terrain that was increasingly compromised by the infected migrating through the high country. The ridge had become a highway for the dead, and every passage across it was a toll we paid in risk. "We need a permanent crossing solution," Vera said. "Not a path through them." a path over them. Over. She pointed to the survey map, where the ridge narrowed to a spine between two drainages. Here. The ridge is maybe 15 feet wide. On either side, the drop is nearly vertical. If we could rig a rope traverse above the ridge, anchored to trees on both sides, we could cross above head height. They can't reach up effectively. Their shoulder articulation is the first thing to degrade. It was audacious. It was also the kind of solution that only someone who'd spent years in mountain rescue would conceive. I looked at Shay, who was listening from her seat by the fire. "Can it be built?" I asked. "With the right cordage and anchor points, yes. It would take 2 days and someone willing to set the far side anchor while the ridge is occupied." "I'll do it," Amir said from the floor where he sat, eating a rehydrated meal with the slow deliberation of someone who hadn't had a hot dinner in weeks. "I climb. Electrical work means pole work. I've been on ropes my whole career." Jo coughed from her cot. The sound was already less wet than yesterday, the antibiotics beginning their invisible war. She opened her eyes and looked at Amir. "Don't you dare die on a rope for a can of beans," she said. It was the first full sentence I'd heard from her, and it carried the weight of a relationship whose history I could only glimpse. Amir smiled. "I've done worse for less." Building the rope traverse took 3 days instead of 2, because on the first day, the ridge was too active. Through binoculars, we counted over 60 infected spread along the quarter-mile spine, their bodies dark against the snow, moving with that dreaming slowness the cold imposed. Amir waited. On the second day, a weather system moved through and dropped the temperature to single digits. The infected locked up. Frost cemented their feet to the ground and their joints to their sockets. Amir made his move. I watched from the saddle with Shay beside me, her bow ready, as Amir descended to the ridge with 200 feet of climbing rope coiled across his chest. He moved among the frozen infected like a man walking through a sculpture garden, stepping around rigid bodies, ducking beneath arms frozen in mid-gesture, his breath clouding in the air. His face was a mask of concentration so complete it bordered on a different state of consciousness. He didn't look at them. He looked through them, navigating by terrain rather than threat, treating them as obstacles of a particular shape rather than entities of a particular horror. He reached the far side, anchored the rope to a mountain hemlock with a series of climbing knots I recognized from arborist work bowline. Figure 8, tensioned with a trucker's hitch that could be adjusted from either end. Then he crossed back, hand over hand, suspended 8 feet above the frozen dead, his body swaying in the wind, and anchored the near side to a basalt outcropping. When he dropped to the ground beside us, his hands were bleeding from in the rope, and his eyes were wide with a chemical alertness that would take hours to metabolize. "Done," he said. "Let's never do that again." The traverse changed everything. Within a week, we'd made 3 supply runs to the secondary caches, stockpiling food and materials that transformed our position from precarious to tenable. We had enough freeze-dried rations for 2 months. Medical supplies for common injuries and illnesses, tools that allowed us to expand the cabin. Amir and I added a lean-to extension that gave us sleeping space for all 7, plus a dedicated storage area. The community on the bench above Thornton Creek Falls settled into a rhythm that wasn't comfort, but was something close to it. Shay hunted the western slopes where the infected presence was thinnest, bringing back game that we smoked and stored. Marcus, his leg healing under the full antibiotic course Jo had insisted he take instead of her. "I'm getting better. Your leg is still open. Don't be an idiot," she'd said. Began walking again by the 3rd week, first with a crutch Amir fashioned from a forked branch, then on his own. Vera and I maintained the defenses and monitored the ridge. The traverse allowed us to observe migration patterns from a safe vantage point, and what we saw troubled me. The numbers were increasing, not gradually, in surges. Every few days, a new group would crest the ridge from the east, driven upward by whatever pressure was building in the valleys. The cascades were filling with them the way a bathtub fills from a dripping faucet. Imperceptibly at first, Then suddenly, faster than expected, Lily remained silent. But her behavior had evolved in ways that gave me a fragile, provisional hope. She worked alongside each of us, helping Shay with game preparation, sorting supplies with Vera, carrying tools for Amir, and she'd begun to draw. Using a charcoal stick from the fire pit and the blank backs of pages from a logbook found in a cache, she produced images of startling clarity. The cabin, the waterfall, the mountains, our faces, rendered with a 7-year-old's proportional looseness, but an emotional accuracy that stopped me cold the first time I saw her drawing of me. She captured something in my expression I hadn't known was visible, a weariness that lived beneath the competence, like bedrock beneath topsoil. She drew one other thing. In the corner of every page, small and consistent, she drew a figure with long hair holding 2 knives, her mother, always walking away. I kept every drawing. They were the only record of what we were building. The night it happened, the waterfall had been silent for 6 days. The creek had frozen solid at the lip, sealing the cascade beneath a shelf of ice that extended over the cliff edge like a translucent balcony. Without the fall's acoustic cover, the mountain had become unnervingly quiet. Every sound we made, footsteps, conversation, the crack of firewood, traveled outward into the night with a clarity that made me flinch. I was on watch at the northern barrier when I heard the first collapse. A deep, structural groan from the eastern face, followed by a sound like a massive branch breaking. I scrambled to the cliff edge and looked down. The ice shelf over the falls had fractured. A section the size of a car had broken away and fallen 70 feet, shattering on the granite basin below with an explosion of sound that echoed through the valley like a cannon shot. The noise rolled outward in concentric waves, bouncing off the valley walls, amplifying, sustaining itself far longer than any sound we'd produced in 2 months of habitation. I knew what it meant before I saw the first one move. In the valley below, illuminated by a moon so bright the snow reflected it, like a second sky, dark figures began to orient. Dozens at first, then scores, then a number I couldn't count. Emerging from tree lines, rising from snowdrifts where they'd been dormant, turning toward the source of the sound with that terrible synchronized attention. And they began to move. Toward the falls, toward us. I woke everyone. 7 people in a cabin, dressed and armed in under 3 minutes. Marcus took the northern barrier with Amir. Shay positioned herself on the boulder with every arrow she had. Vera and I took the eastern cliff edge, looking down at the approach. "They can't climb the falls," Vera said. "They've never been able to climb the falls. They've never had 100 bodies pushing against the base at the same time." She understood. The infected didn't climb through individual capability. They climbed through accumulation. Bodies piling against an obstacle, each one providing a platform for the next. We'd seen it in the videos before the internet died. Swarm behavior, the same mechanics that allowed ants to bridge gaps with their own bodies. Given enough mass, they could surmount anything. The first wave reached the basin within the hour. From above, they were a dark tide flooding the granite bowl, pressing against the base of the frozen falls. The ice held, their weight compressed against it, bodies stacking, arms reaching upward. The ice held, and then, with a sound like the mountain cracking its knuckles, it didn't. The frozen cascade sheared away in a massive plate, crushing dozens beneath it but creating a ramp of compacted ice and bodies that angled from the basin to a ledge 20 feet up the face. And they climbed, crawling over the fallen, gripping the ice, pulling themselves upward with a single-mindedness that defied everything we'd believed about their limitations. "Flare," I said. Shay fired the first cartridge. It arced over the cliff edge and descended into the mass below, casting the scene in red light that turned the valley into something from a painting of perdition. The horde didn't react to the light. They reacted to nothing except the upward imperative. "We go below," Marcus shouted from the barrier. "The rope traverse, across the ridge, now." We grabbed what we could carry, packs pre-staged for this contingency. Vera's idea, implemented a week ago against my protest that we wouldn't need them. Every person had a go bag by their sleeping area. We had the cabin emptied of essentials in 4 minutes. Lily was the last through the door. She paused at the threshold, turned back, and placed her palm flat against the door frame. The same gesture she'd made the first night, pressing her hand to the timber. A farewell to the thing we'd built. Then she turned and ran. We crossed the northern barrier, sprinted the ridge trail, and reached the rope traverse as the first infected pulled themselves over the cliff edge onto the bench behind us. One by one, we crossed, swinging above the frozen dead on the ridge, hand over hand, into the darkness on the other side. We found a second bench on the western slope, lower, less defensible, but empty. Dawn found the 7 of us standing in a meadow dusted with new snow, watching the sun break over the ridge we'd fled across. Behind that ridge, our cabin still stood. I knew this because no smoke rose from it. No sound came from it. It was intact, abandoned, perfect, and no longer ours. Lily tugged my sleeve. I looked down. She had the charcoal stick in one hand, a blank page in the other. She held them up to me, then pointed at the meadow around us. She wanted me to see what she saw. Not an ending, but a surface waiting to be marked. Amir was already surveying the tree line. Shay had an arrow nocked, scanning the perimeter. Marcus tested the soil with his boot heel, assessing foundations. Vera unfolded the survey map and began marking a new position. Joe, breathing clearly for the first time in weeks, turned to me and asked the only question that mattered. Same plan? I looked at Lily. She pressed the charcoal to the page and drew a single line. The slope of a roof. Same plan, I said. We build again.